All right, good afternoon, everyone. This is Shannon Kalis with the Hectone Institute. Welcome back to our biweekly long-term care and congregate care infection prevention and control update call. Please note that, as usual, all attendees are currently in listen-only mode. If you do have any questions during the webinar, please feel free to submit them in the Q&A pod, and the panelists will answer them during the webinar. And a recording of this presentation and a copy of the slides will be sent out once we have ended for today. And then finally, we are again offering continuing education for attending. You'll be prompted to complete the evaluation survey once the presentations are over. So please be sure to complete that if you want your credit for attending. So for today's agenda, we'll start by looking at the upcoming webinars, and then we will introduce two new programs, one by Dr. Shelley Fisher about the Respiratory Protection Program, and then Dr. Hershow and his partners at UIC will tell us about their new VRD project, followed by a presentation on implementing personal protective equipment in nursing homes, and this will include discussions about enhanced barrier precautions. Finally, after all of that, we will have the open Q&A. So here's the list of upcoming webinars for the spring of 2024. A siren did go out with this registration information, so please sign up if you have not already. And then before we get into UIC's presentation, I just want to see if Dr. Shelley Fisher is on and can introduce herself really quick. Dr. Fisher, are you here? Okay, I don't see her, so we can go ahead and get started with our UIC colleagues' presentation.
Well, thank you. I'll get us started. This is Ron Hershow. I'm the director of the Division of Epidemiology and Biostatistics at UIC School of Public Health, and it's my pleasure to talk to you all today and to offer a further introduction to what we call the VRD project, or Viral Respiratory Disease Project. I'm just going to do a brief introduction and then turn the program over to my colleagues at UIC to give you some more direct exposure to what our intervention may look like as it rolls out to participants, staff at long-term care facilities. And I would say that most, if not all, of the persons in this room can all cast their eyes back and remember the horrendous respiratory disease outbreaks that occurred in long-term care facilities in the earliest stages of the COVID-19 pandemic. There was a time in Illinois, and of course in many other states, when over 50% of COVID-19 mortality was concentrated in long-term care facilities. In fact, many in this room participated in the Illinois Department of Public Health's Congregate Homes Response Team, an academic public health partnership to assist facilities in dealing with the challenge of these horrendous outbreaks. Although we have made clearly great strides, still 4 years after the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, the 1,600 Illinois long-term care facilities continue to experience outbreaks of COVID-19 and other viral respiratory diseases like influenza and respiratory syncytial virus. Next slide, please. To prevent and mitigate the severity of these outbreaks, UIC School of Public Health, in collaboration with Illinois Department of Public Health, developed a two-component intervention. The first component consists of online training for the staff of long-term care facilities to offer them concentrated education regarding outbreak prevention, investigation, and mitigation. Next slide, please. The training component is divided into two parts. In the first part, we offer educational training on outbreak investigations packaged within 20 online modules that focus on lessons learned during real-world outbreak investigations with, of course, an emphasis on viral respiratory diseases that affect long-term care facilities. This training was developed by UIC's Dr. Mark Dworkin and many of our students at UIC and staff at UIC. And as many of you know, Dr. Dworkin was a former Illinois state epidemiologist, and he has edited and contributed to several textbooks on outbreak investigation and field epidemiology. Indeed, one of them is the textbook for the proposed training that will be assigned our trainees. We call the second component the Outbreak Investigation Boot Camp, but at this point, I'm going to turn the lectern over to Natalia Lopez-Llanes, who will give us a real direct exposure to what these trainings may look like. So turn it over to Natalia at this point.
Thank you, Dr. Hershow. Pleasure to be here with everyone today. If you could please advance to the next slide. Before we actually move into the boot camp, I do have a short video clip that I want to share with you all, a teaser, if you will, of what you can expect from the outbreak investigation training. But before we move on to that, I did want to provide a sneak peek of the topics for the outbreak investigation training. As you can see, there are a number of viral respiratory disease outbreaks, but it certainly is not limited to this topic. But just a little bit of a preview of what's to come with this program. So next slide, please.
We keep talking about explosiveness, but an equally important characteristic is severity. And here we see that 25% of residents died during this outbreak. Now, death is the ultimate and the worst outcome. So for a quarter of the residents to die during this outbreak, something really bad went on in this facility. So let's try to find out what that was. A few slides ago, I showed you some features of long-term care facilities that can predispose them to an outbreak like this. Now let's see what went on specifically at this facility. They had a number of prevention measures in place that made them feel comfortable before this outbreak began. Here's what they were. They first had a working ventilation system that moved fresh air throughout the facility that was filtered through an F7 filter. Information on proper hand washing techniques and the use of hand sanitizer was available, as well as easily accessible throughout the facility. Now let's take a look at the prevention and control measures performed by facility and health department staff. They had a nursing home intervention team that was established by the local health department at the start of the pandemic to support nursing homes. During the outbreak, on 2 occasions, February 5th and February 9th, the intervention team visited the nursing home to educate staff on the proper use of PPE. Prior to the start of the outbreak, the intervention team was testing residents twice per week and staff every other week. And at the start of this outbreak, all tests were negative. And so, with so many preventive measures in place, what then were the risk points? Now I'm finally getting to the good part where I tell you why things went so badly here.
And that is actually the end of the clip. To provide a little bit of background, this video clip is from one of our modules on COVID-19 and vaccine efficacy. It is based on an explosive COVID-19 outbreak in a German nursing home. So as you can see with some of those outbreak investigation trainings, the videos will really tell you a story of what happened, how the outbreaks were dealt with, and what was learned. So I hope that clip excited you for what more is to come. Transitioning to the second training element about the boot camp and the toolkit, I do want to note that the format of the boot camps are much different than what you just saw with the outbreak investigation training. The boot camps focus more on providing practical guidance on the prevention, investigation, and control of outbreaks, specifically this time of COVID-19, influenza, and RSV. The videos provide an in-depth look at state and federal guidance, while also providing rationale and real-world examples. There are 8 video modules, which will go hand in hand with the toolkit, which my colleague Chloe will share a sneak peek of this in just a couple of minutes. And this toolkit organizes all the resources and guidelines from the videos and more really. So our goal is to have all of this information quick and easy to reference for you. We've also developed a novel Excel-based tracker tool, which facilitates the monitoring of evolving outbreaks and strives to facilitate both NHSN reporting and local health department reporting needs. This tool is going to be available, of course, in the toolkit, and we also are going to have a companion video tutorial available as well for those long-term care facilities that are interested in learning more. Next slide, please. I have another sneak peek video, which I'll share in a moment, which comes from our last module on managing staffing shortages. But these are some of the topics that you can expect from bootcamp modules. Each module is going to cover a number of topics, again, which go hand in hand with the toolkit, and you'll get a sneak peek of what that looks like in a moment. So if you would please advance to the next slide, we can do the clip for the bootcamp.
So, how are minimum staffing ratios met? There are 3 steps to this process. The first step is to determine the number of residents requiring each type of care. The second step is to calculate the total number of care hours of each level of care. And the third step is to add the total number of care hours for each type of care to determine the total minimum number of hours required to provide direct care to all residents. The steps to this process are outlined in depth on the Communicable Disease Code, Section 300-1230 in Line K, and Appendix A provides a detailed example of this process. Let's look at that example now to better understand how to ensure that minimum staffing ratios are met by scheduled staff and facilities. As a reminder, the first step is to determine the number of residents requiring each type of care. In our example, which involves a 100-bed skilled nursing facility, there are 25 residents requiring skilled care and 75 residents requiring an intermediate care. The second step is to calculate the total number of care hours for each type of care. So, for those residents requiring skilled care, which remember is 25, we would multiply that number by 3.8 based on the minimum ratio rule. From here, we get 95, which equals 95 total care hours of skilled care. Let's now do the same for intermediate care. We know there are 75 residents needing intermediate care, so we multiply that number by 2.5 based on the minimum ratio rule, and here we get 187.5, which equals to 187.5 total care hours of intermediate care. When we add the total hours needed per day per facility of each type of care, we end up with 282.5 total care hours.
So again, that is just a short clip from our last module on managing staffing shortages. Of course, you will note that this is very different from the very story-based format of the previous outbreak training, but we hope that you find these modules helpful. With that, I will hand it over to my colleague, Chloe, who is going to share a sneak peek of our soon-to-launch website, which contains all of our course materials. So I will hand it over to Chloe.
Hello, everyone. Like Natalia said, I'm going to be briefly going over the website that it holds all of this information that will be launching, expected to be launching next week. As you can see on this slide right here is our login page that goes into a brief overview of the project and the services that are available to participants on our website. Next slide, please. To sign up for the website and the program itself, there's a brief survey needed to be collected for long-term care facility staff members and local health department members. The questions are specific to the roles, either long-term care facility employees or local health department employees, and this just helps us to identify who is signing up for the course. Next slide, please. This image shows you the home page of our website as it should look. As you can see, there are sections for the bootcamp modules, and the outbreak trainings. It should show you the progress to completion for the program, and this will be your home page whenever you log in. So you'll be able to see your progress throughout the course and be able to navigate back to different videos and sections as needed. Next slide, please. As Natalia mentioned, we also make available for participants a toolkit which has hyperlinks to necessary resources relating to viral respiratory disease control and prevention in long-term care facilities, in addition to any kind of required reporting tools, any guidance that is related to these topics. These will be a living document, so they will be updated when new guidance is released. But as of this moment, it will have the most up-to-date information available to us when the website launches. Additionally, this is, like I said, available to all participants who sign up, no matter the progress in the course, and will be available to those individuals to reference back if needed. Next slide, please. This screenshot shows an example of what a video like the clips that Natalia presented will appear as on the website. It will also include additional materials that are referenced within the videos themselves that can also be viewed by participants to reference the resources mentioned in the videos and also to save any resources that may be useful for the participants themselves. Next slide, please. Finally, as an element of this project, we have a consultative request system in which long-term care facility staff members can request consultations with the infectious disease experts on our staff, including Dr. Hirschau. This will be available via a link on our website and will involve a submission of a form that goes into the details of the particular request being made. So the information about the outbreaks, any kind of details that can be provided, whether the individual has been in contact with the local health department, and details like that. This will be then fed into our system, and further outreach will be conducted by a member of our team in order to facilitate the consultation, and will include consultation with local health departments and, if need be, IDPH in order to ensure that everyone is aware of the situation and providing the most up-to-date and correct resources and guidance. This is, like I said, just a brief overview of the website. There are multiple other functionalities available to individuals. And as I said, we anticipate launching in the next week with an announcement to follow. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Natalia. Thank you, Chloe. I just wanted to ask you to elaborate a little bit on the honorarium for the training programs and also how long each module takes to complete. I think that would be of interest. So.
Absolutely. Thank you, Dr. Hirschau. Participants that complete 75% of both boot camps and the outbreak trainings are eligible for an honorarium. In terms of the, I'm so sorry, the second question that you, the length of time for the video modules. The boot camp modules are slightly longer. On average, they're going to be about 40 minutes long. The outbreak training modules, they are going to be a little bit shorter. They range between 25 to probably 35 minutes on average. So a little bit longer for boot camp, a little bit shorter for the outbreak trainings. But again, there are more outbreak training modules to complete in order to earn the honorarium. More information on the honorarium specifically and requirements will be detailed on our website in the FAQs, and they're also included in each introduction video to the course for those that are interested in further information.
Thank you for that excellent presentation. Before we move on to Karen's presentation, I do want to give Dr. Shelley Fisher a chance to introduce herself. Dr. Fisher, are you on?
I am. Thank you so much for giving me just a minute. I'm Shelley Fisher. I'm with Project Hope. I'm the clinical consultant lead for the Respiratory Protection Program offering. And I presented at the CDPH roundtable yesterday. I know many of you were there. I know we've probably touched just about everybody in this group at one point or another in terms of what the program entails. But I will put my email address in the chat box or the Q&A box so that you all can contact me with questions. I wanted to remind everybody that we have one more session beginning in March, and that consists of the virtual training as well as in-person on-site fit testing at a central location. And we have another session in May. We're taking registrations for both of those sessions at this point, and we don't want to see anybody miss out. It's a really exciting opportunity, offering the training, the fit testing, train the trainer training, as well as procurement funded by IDPH at the end of the program that will allow you to purchase through our budgeted funds equipment, supplies, and medical evaluations as needed to bolster the implementation of your respiratory protection program. So please contact me with questions or information about registration. Karen, thank you so much for allowing that minute.
No problem. No problem. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Karen Trimberger going to talk to you today about implementing personal protective equipment in nursing homes to prevent the spread of extensively drug-resistant organisms, or XDROs, and multi-drug resistant organisms, MDROs. And we're calling this part 2, introducing the Enhanced Barrier Precautions, or EBP Toolkit. I have talked on this topic before, so some of these slides will look a little familiar, but I've added a few additional slides as well. And I wanted to, again, talk through the toolkit itself. Next slide. So today's objectives is describe the contents of the toolkit, provide you a list of necessary resources for facilities implementing EBP, and want to highlight again and differentiate between what we are considering MDROs and XDROs, specifically that terminology within the toolkit, so that you're clear on that. And then talk about assessing risk and what that looks like as far as trying to determine what type of precautions, transmission-based precautions might be needed, or if they're even warranted at all. And then providing cohort options for you to follow for bed placement. Next slide. So why enhanced barrier precautions? Contact precautions alone has failed to control the transmission of multi-drug resistant organisms in nursing homes. How do we know this? Well, remember a while back, I did present a slide on an article from McKenna et al. In the Clinical Infectious Disease Journal back in 2019, where they looked at nursing homes and they did a study on 14 nursing homes. And 17% of the residents within the facility had documented multi-drug resistant organisms. But when they actually did screening and testing, they found out it was really 58%. So we've got a lot of hidden, the burden is hidden, we're not always aware of it. And then the study went on to show that in ventilator-associated homes, it was even a higher percentage. Next slide. So we talk about enhanced barrier precautions, balancing person-centered or resident-centered care and risk. And so this little infographic here from Deb Birdsall paints that picture pretty good. It's this balancing act. You're feeling like it's a little bit caught in the middle a little bit. So from a patient-centered or a person-centered aspect, residents need to socialize and they need to participate in the communal dining and the group activities. Isolation's scary, often stigmatizing if they're required to stay in their rooms unless they can come out for medically necessary procedures. But residents on enhanced barrier precautions are not restricted to their rooms, and they're able to leave and participate in those activities in communal dining. And so it's more person-centered approach. And then we also want to look at the risk. Is that resident colonized or infected with an XDRO or an MDRO? And do they have any indwelling medical devices or open wounds, severely immunocompromised, things along that line? And we want to make sure that the EBP is going to help protect that resident at risk for requiring any colonization. Next slide. So what are enhanced barrier precautions? I know we've talked about this before, but just to highlight again, CDC kind of calls it an added intervention, infection control intervention. It's sort of between standard precautions and contact precautions. It expands the use of PPE beyond situations in which exposure to blood and body fluids is anticipated. It does require the use of gowns and gloves when performing high contact resident care activities, toileting, bathing, changing sheets and things along those lines, clothing. It does not require the gown and glove if you're not performing those high contact activities. Room restrictions are not required. People are allowed to participate in activities, and it offers better protection for the resident. And we're looking at this from a prevention side of things. Next slide. Just a quick glance here of what the CDC sign looks like. Emphasizing again, private rooms would not be required. Residents are able to participate in group activities. And the thing about enhanced barrier precautions is it's intended to be used for the resident's entire length of stay. And that goes back to then balancing that person-centered and risk and really thinking about, okay, this is their home. And what can we do to make it more home-like by balancing risk with the person-centered care? Next slide. Okay, so now getting into the actual toolkit. Hopefully you all received the siren back on January 31st that Caroline sent out, and the HAI coordinator. Within that, she introduced the EBP toolkit, and the document is rather long. It's 40-some pages long, so it's a hyperlink that'll take you to the site where you can either print off or at least access electronically all the time, and a brief description of what is included within the toolkit. And there is the toolkit link also at the bottom of the slide, and on the right-hand side of this is just the front page of what the toolkit looks like. Next slide. Now let's look at what is actually in it. The thought with creating the toolkit was that we would provide you, if you were somebody at a facility and it was your responsibility, if you're the infection preventionist, education coordinator, whatever your role might be, and you're told that we need to implement this, we wanted to be able to provide you with a toolkit or a packet of things that you would need in order to make this happen. So we do provide you some introduction and description as to why enhanced barrier precaution is recommended by the CDC. We talk about the definitions of MDRO and XDRO, and I'll get into that a little bit more here pretty soon. Summarize best practices. We also provided some algorithms for decision-making for the types of transmission-based precautions that might be necessary. Another added feature in the toolkit is we provided directions on how to query the XDRO registry, because that is something we want you to do in order to find out if the resident is colonized or infected with an XDRO. Some interfacility transfer forms. Again, another tool that can be used to share information, communicate back and forth amongst each other to make sure that this type of information on MDRO, XDRO status is provided to one another so that at the receiving end, they can do the right thing when they admit the resident. A copy of the CDC isolation signs and links to access those, cohorting options, roommate options, etc. And then the actual education and competency resources. So we have an in-service attendance sheet in there, a PowerPoint presentation on enhanced barrier precautions. It is a video, or you can simply look at the slide deck, whichever you prefer. There's a post-test, directions on how to don and doff, and then a competency validation sheet for donning and doffing of PPE. So hopefully we've included everything that you would need to then begin to implement EBP within your facility. Next slide. CDC recommendations for EBP. This comes right out of the document from CDC. And one statement that I wanted to emphasize here is MDROs for which the use of EBP applies are based on local epidemiology. And at a minimum, they should include resistant organisms targeted by the CDC, but can also include other epidemiological important MDROs. Why do I bring this up? It's because if you look at our toolkit, some of the language in there, some of the direction in there is based upon the state of Illinois' epidemiology. So CDC has allowed states some flexibility on these recommendations to implement what they feel is the right thing to do based upon the epidemiology in our states. And we know that Illinois has a fairly high burden of some of these XDROs. Next slide. Terminology taken directly from the toolkit. We've talked about this before, but I want to emphasize it again because I don't want people confused in the terminology. When we're referring to the novel or targeted XDRO, the Illinois Department of Public Health is referring to these organisms, the ones that are entered into the XDRO registry, the Candida auris, the carbapenem-resistant Enterobacterales, et cetera. When referring to others, we're talking, or MDROs, we're talking about MRSA, VRE, ESBLs, Pseudomonas aeruginosa, et cetera. Next slide. So these statements are different from CDC. You can see that little shout out box at the top there. CDC does not use the term XDROs. That's specific to Illinois. Illinois Department of Public Health created the registry so that we could have a handle and a spot so that these extensively drug-resistant organisms were entered, and we would have a way to communicate between facilities on the status of these for residents. And so this term is not used by CDC, so it's specific to us. And we also recognize that all multi-drug resistant organisms are considered MDROs, and that the XDROs, Candida auris, et cetera, are a subset of the MDROs. But for ease of use, we thought it was easier to say we would have two buckets, the MDROs, which are the ones listed on the bottom part, and the XDROs, which are more of the bigger bugs, so to speak. Next slide. This table is not in the toolkit. This was something I thought, again, just might be another way to help explain. If you look across the top, or excuse me, on the left margin, you'll see the different organisms, exactly what I just mentioned previously. But then across the top, you'll see CDC's terms or terminology for these organisms. They'll call the XDROs the novel or the targeted MDROs. But in our toolkit and in Illinois, we're referring those same bugs as an extensively drug-resistant or an XDRO. And then we're both calling the MRSAs, the ESBLs, VREs, et cetera, as epidemiologic important MDROs. So hopefully that's helpful. Next slide. Thought it might be also good to see how CDC actually defines novel and targeted MDRO. So the novel is an organism with a resistant phenotype or a resistance mechanism that's never or very rarely been identified in the United States. Experience with these organisms is limited, and a more extensive evaluation is needed to define the risk for transmission. And then if you look at the targeted, an organism resistant to most or all available antimicrobials with the potential to spread widely. Intensive public health actions are required to slow the spread of targeted MDROs. So Shannon, if you could just flip back one slide real quick. So again, CDC, these are the bugs that we're talking, the C. auris, et cetera, this carbapenem-resistant organisms. CDC is going to call them novel or targeted. We're going to call them in Illinois XDROs. Go ahead and go forward now. And then the next one. So I thought this was interesting, and I thought it might be, many of you have seen this, obviously, working in long-term care, but this is the document from CDC, the Management of Multi-Drug Resistant Organisms in Healthcare Settings from 2006. And under this section here for long-term care, VA5CII, number 1 there, consider the individual patient's clinical situation and prevalence or incidence of MDROs in the facility when deciding whether to implement or modify contact precautions in addition to standard precautions for a patient infected or colonized with a target MDRO. I thought that was interesting because this was way back in 2006. 2019 is when we began to hear about enhanced barrier, but lo and behold, it's the same thing, is it not? We're modifying contact precautions. We're doing something different. It's an enhanced barrier precautions. So you in the long-term care facilities, you've been doing this a long time. Now, how you modified it at the time was you were allowing, if the drainage could be contained, clean hands, clean gown, they could come out of contact precautions. Now we're going to, remember in previous presentation, I shared the old paradigm, the new paradigm. Now contact precautions is going to be where you stay in your room if you're on contact precautions. And this phrase, this number one here, is really enhanced barrier. You modified it a long time and you've been doing this a long time. That's the other thing I thought it would be interesting to share, because you guys have been doing this. I don't want you to be afraid of it, so to speak. The terminology is different. You got to be clear on that and the consistent practice, but it's what you've been doing all along. It's just it just has a different name. Next slide. Okay, let's get into how do you determine if transmission-based precautions is even warranted and what are you supposed to do. So you need to consider two different approaches, or what we're calling facility level approaches, to determine if it's warranted: pathogen-based and risk-based. Next slide. Assessing risk. So we've already been talking about this, but all organisms are not the same. Many of the XDRO organisms are a serious threat to public health. Many of these infections are difficult to treat and have been associated with high mortality rates. And due to the movement of patients throughout the healthcare system, if one organisms, insert any name here, are a problem in one facility, then typically they are a problem in other facilities in the region as well. And this is the infographic from CDC, again, showing the interconnectivity of all of our facilities. People go in for a procedure, they come back out, they go to post-acute care for a little bit, they go back home, et cetera, et cetera. But in the center is the local health department, because you guys play an integral part in knowing what's going on throughout your county, et cetera. Next slide. So let's look again, going back to assessing risk, and look at pathogen-based approach. You should evaluate every resident admitted to your facility to determine if transmission-based precautions are even warranted, and start by looking at the pathogen. Is the resident colonized or infected with an XDRO? And again, I'm using the Illinois Department of Public Health terminology here. Is the resident colonized or infected with an MDRO? Again, those bugs that we had considered an MDRO. Next slide. So if the resident has an XDRO, there is a risk of them spreading these organisms to others, the transmission. They should be cared for using standard precautions and at a minimum of enhanced barrier precautions to prevent the potential transmission of these organisms to other residents that are ill or immunocompromised or at risk. However, there's always the caveats, right? If the person with the XDRO pathogen has wounds with drains that cannot be contained, or diarrhea, they should be on contact precautions, to prevent the potential transmission of this organism. Next slide. So same question here, but this time we're going to ask, do they have an MDRO? And the statement in here is not all MDROs will require transmission-based precautions. And this is where we get into looking at the resident's clinical situation, and also looking at the prevalence and incidence of MDROs in your facility. So let's start with the clinical situation. Do they have an active infection? Are they immunocompromised? Do they have indwelling medical devices or wounds that require addressing? If you answer yes, consider caring for these residents with standard precautions and enhanced barrier precautions. Now, I know they're an MDRO, but again, this is active infections. They have indwelling medical devices, wounds requiring dressing, etc. Then let's look at the prevalence or incidence of MDROs in your building. Have you ever encountered this organism before in the building? Any issues with maintaining control? Was there any transmission, etc. at the time? Is the organism considered endemic in your area? If so, maybe transmission-based precautions is not required. That's going to be a facility decision. But if the organism is new to the building, perhaps you would want to place the person in enhanced barrier precautions to prevent possible transmission of that organism. Next slide. So what does it mean to be endemic? We've been asked this question a few times. So basically, just from a Bing search or whatever, it's of a disease regularly occurring within an area or community. CDC defines it as cases are regularly identified in healthcare facilities across the region, including those in different transfer networks. Remember that infographic I just showed you, different transfer networks? You know, we're, again, all in the same region. People are going to and fro. And this is where the local health departments play a very integral part. Next slide. So how would a facility know if a pathogen is considered endemic? First thing right here, contact your local health department to discuss the pathogens within your facility and in your area, the other healthcare networks in your county, etc. And if you don't currently have a line list of the pathogens that are in your building, now's the time to start developing that list. Mary Alice Lavin created a couple documents for us here. This is a link to that. It's a basic organism line list. This is extremely helpful when you're determining bed placement, identifying clusters, outbreaks, but also being able to recognize, do you have this? Have you ever seen this organism before in your building? If you've got this laundry list or this line list of everything in your building, you're going to know. Now, I've had people say, well, does that mean I need to go backwards and start screening everybody? Nope, that's not what we said, but start now and begin to keep track. And then consider using the facility organism risk assessment, again, something created by Mary Alice for us, when you're creating your facility policies and procedures for enhanced barrier precautions. I'm going to just give you a snippet of both of these. I don't have time to go into a lot of detail. Next slide. So again, basic line list here. Here's the link to to be able to access it. Patient name, date of birth, admission date, room number, things along those lines, culture date, and then when you click on the cells starting in M, N, etc., you're going to have a drop-down menu here. And she has populated these with the organisms. And then the same is true for the mechanism of resistance. So you'll see oxy 2340, et cetera, in column N. But in M, there's a list of all of the organisms. So hopefully this will be helpful to you. Next slide. This again is a very basic document, but it shows that you have had a discussion with your health department, you're implementing enhanced barrier precautions, and you've thought about what organisms are in your building and what those that you consider endemic or not, and that you believe that you can care for using standard precautions and you do not need to implement enhanced barrier, as well as what organisms that you plan on using enhanced barrier precautions for, et cetera. So again, don't have a lot of time left in the webinar to go through these. So if you have questions, just send them to us and we can address them then. Next slide. Okay, so now we're going to look at risk. So the risk-based approach is going to look at the same resident that you asked about the XDRO and MDRO, but now we're going to say what factors puts this resident at an increased risk, regardless if they have colonization or infection status. And that's going to be wounds requiring dressings and an indwelling medical device. Next slide. You've seen these slides before too. What do we mean by wounds requiring dressings, and you know, what type of wound are we talking about? CDC does not include the typical skin tear, et cetera, with that you're covering with a Band-Aid as a wound requiring a dressing. We're talking about the more extensive wounds here, ulcers, pressure ulcers, diabetic foot ulcers, et cetera. When we say unhealed surgical wounds, again, we are not talking about a fresh post-op surgical. We're talking about truly a surgical, a past surgery that has not healed properly. And so a wound is requiring a dressing there. Next slide. And then again, indwelling medical devices, what do we classify here as a medical device? And I'll have you read these, but a stoma is not an indication for enhanced barrier. Next slide. So determining the type of transmission-based precautions necessary. So use EBP for residents with wounds requiring dressings, unless the drainage cannot be contained or the residents colonized or infected with an infection on the CDC's guideline for isolation precautions, Appendix A, where they recommend contact precautions. Same is true for B. This is with an indwelling medical device. They would require, that person would require enhanced barrier precautions unless they are colonized or infected with something that's listed in Appendix A that would require contact precautions. Next slide. This is a ready reference. This is not in your toolkit either. I just thought this might be a quick cheat sheet, so to speak. Pathogens are in the left column. What type of pathogen is this, an XDRO or a multi-drug resistant organism? And what type of precautions are going to be needed? EBP is required at a minimum for your XDROs. We just talked about that, but use contact precautions if there's resident has wounds with drainage that can't be contained, or they have a pathogen listed in Appendix A. And then multi-drug resistant organisms, is residents co-infected with an XDRO? If so, then they're going to require EBP at a minimum. And then the caveat about if the wounds the drainage cannot be contained in a wound. If it's an MDRO and there is no co-infection, I mean, that's the thing you have to always think about too, right? How many organisms does the resident have? So if they have at least one that's an XDRO, then you're automatically into enhanced barrier. But if they're strictly just the multi-drug resistant organisms, then you can begin to look at the prevalence and incidence in your region, et cetera, to assess whether you would need to implement precautions or not. Next slide. So how to implement. Develop your policies and procedures before you implement. Provide education and training to your staff. Use the toolkit. There's resources there for you. Validate the competency of staff on the PPE use. And start slow. Maybe start with one unit, or ensure everybody understands the principles of EBP before moving to the next unit. Maybe you're going to select a unit that has a higher burden of XDROs or MDROs. Start there. Or maybe one that has the ventilator or trach patients that reside on that unit. And then also CDC has a great tool, a pre-implementation tool that'll kind of help walk through this with you and to assess your readiness to implement. Next slide. Resource list here. Next slide. So decision-making. Facilities will need to make some decisions on how to address a few things. So first, organisms you consider endemic. Talk to your local health departments. Have those discussions. 2, what type of precautions you're going to use when a resident is being actively treated for an infection. If a resident has a multi-drug resistant organism or an XDRO and is on antibiotics, based on the CDC recommendations, the resident could technically be on enhanced barrier precautions. However, we have heard many of you tell us that you would leave that person on contact precautions until they are done with the antibiotics. If the organism is an XDRO, which is fine, you can do that as long as that's what your policies say, right? So if the organism is an XDRO, then you could transition after they're off their antibiotics to enhanced barrier, because remember, it's an XDRO. At a minimum, they need to be on enhanced barrier for the duration of their stay. If it's an MDRO, then they may transition to either standard or EBP based upon the organism and your facility risk assessment. That again is your decision. Just make sure your policies reflect this and that you are consistent in your practice. Next slide. ESBLs, lots of concerns about several residents having had an ESBL in their urine, but they've been treated. So why would these residents need to be on enhanced barrier precautions anymore? If it's your first ESBL in your building, use enhanced barrier precautions unless contact precautions will be warranted from that CDC Appendix A list. If your residents have a history of ESBLs in urine and urine can be contained, then you may decide they do not need enhanced barrier precautions. That's a facility decision. However, if you notice there's an increase in cases, again, going back to that line list, right? An increase in cases, a cluster or an outbreak, then you should probably implement enhanced barrier and investigate further, because it's different than what has been your norm. And then number 4, determining the type of transmission-based precautions will require some critical thinking and discussions with your local health departments. Resources are available in the toolkit to help you make these decisions easier, but there's always going to be a case that doesn't quite fit the example, so you will have to talk through what to do with someone. Make sure you use your resources. Reach out to your Illinois Department of Public Health infection prevention coordinators. Reach out to your local health department. Reach out to the Hectone IPs. We're here to help you guys kind of navigate through this and hopefully make sense of it all. Next slide. Okay, algorithms. This is for a new admission, and I know this is small, and so I apologize, but it's pretty much some of those other tables that I showed you, just trying to go through yes and no scenarios. So if you have a new admission, starting with does the resident reside, or does the resident have a draining wound? I can't hardly read it myself, you guys, to be contained, or diarrhea, etc. If the answer is yes, then you're going to put them in contact. That's what we just said. If the answer is no, then you begin to ask the questions about the pathogen. Does the resident have a history or of colonization or infection with an MDRO and XDRO? Here's where we send you to the registry. That's why we provided you with the guidelines on how to access the XDRO registry. We try to put everything in the toolkit so that you would know how to begin this work and follow through these. Again, don't have time to go through each and every yes, no here, but within that, we try to answer the questions for you. If it's a no, go to the next box. If it's a yes, go to the right and follow through. And then they're color coded for contact precautions or enhanced barrier. And again, don't forget, we always want standard precautions to be implemented for all resident care. Next slide. Okay, same thing, but this is somebody now, it's not a new admit, this is somebody already in your building and they have a new positive XDRO or an MDRO, and now what do you do? So it's a little bit less decision points, so to speak, but still the same type of questioning. The only thing that is different here is, if you notice the very first large triangle down from the first start point, we ask if this resident's residing on a unit or in the facility that has ongoing transmission. Because if they do, if that unit is having a lot of issues, we would want them, even though it's an XDRO or an MDO, if you have an outbreak or a situation where you have a lot of transmission, you would want them on contact precautions just to be safe until you can investigate and get things figured out. Next slide. Okay, enhanced barrier. These I actually stole from Liz and the Chicago Department of Public Health because I thought they were succinct and nice or easy to look at. So the duration, remember, enhanced barrier precautions are intended for the duration of the resident's stay. But if somebody is on enhanced barrier only because of having an indwelling medical device or a wound requiring dressing, they could come off. You can transition them off of EBP once that device is removed or the wound no longer requires a dressing. But it's the XDRO and MDRO residents that are colonizer infected that are going to have EBP for the duration of their whole stay. And so ultimately, again, no room restrictions here, but ultimately we're trying to prevent the transmission of MDROs and XDROs to others. Next slide. Contact precautions, generally intended to be time limited, and when implemented should include a plan for discontinuation or de-escalation. So facility prevalence or organisms and containment success should be included in that decision-making about when to de-escalate. Residents are restricted to their rooms. So again, this is different for long-term care of what you guys normally would have called contact precautions. This is what it would look like in an acute care setting now, and long-term care is going to mirror acute care in this setting. So when somebody's on contact precautions, they are restricted to their rooms, and they're only to come out for medically necessary care. And then the goal again is to prevent transmission of MDROs and XDROs to others. Next slide. Duration of transmission-based precautions, everything pretty much that I just said. Again, no time left to go through this, but it goes through the different approaches on the far left, pathogen-based and risk-based. And it's looking at the next column would be XDRO, whether it's an MDRO, whether it's a disease from on the Appendix A. If the risk is based upon wound only, if the risk is based upon having an indwelling medical device, and then whether they would need enhanced barrier precautions and contact precautions, and if so, how long for each of those. So let's just say enhanced barrier and look at the wound requiring a dressing. They would need to be on enhanced barrier until the wound has healed and no longer requires that dressing. Indwelling medical device until that's been removed, etc. Next slide. Document. Be sure to document in the residence care plan that you've considered the risks and what type of risks, and if transmission-based precautions are necessary. If you're implementing EBP slowly, make sure your infection control risk assessment speaks to this, or are you doing a process improvement program? Ensure documentation addresses the risks. And be mindful of your policies. What do they say about enhanced barrier precautions and contact precautions, and when you're going to use them, especially if you have only partially implemented them in the building? And we don't want you to get cited for something like that. Now, again, this is where that, ESBLs, residents with history of ESBLs in their urine, you've decided that they do not need to be on enhanced barrier because it's endemic, etc. So your policies should reflect that. And then consider using the facility organism risk assessment created by Hectone, or that document that I shared with you earlier. It's about 2/3 of a page long when you're creating your facility policies and procedures, because it will lay out and cause you to write out what organisms you consider endemic in your building, and then what organisms you are planning on doing enhanced barrier precautions in your building. Next slide. Room placement and cohorting options. Next, go ahead. Next slide. Again, note there isn't time to go through this today, and I wasn't going to anyway. I know there's always question regarding room placement, but this is within the toolkit, and there's also resources available with the local health department and IDPH guidance and CDC guidance to help you determine who can room with who. And I believe this document is pretty specific as far as who can room together, like mechanisms, resistant patterns, etc. So please follow this, and if you have any questions, reach out to someone for help. Next slide. And then, interest of time, we're not going to go through the scenarios, but they will be in your slide deck. Any questions? I think I got like a minute left. Deb, Mary Alice, any questions in there?
You might be able to answer this one real quick, Karen. Do residents with a history of MDRO, XDRO have to be placed on EBP after treatment?
XDRO, absolutely. XDRO, yes. The MDRO, that's where we get into is it endemic in your building or not? And also the risk of the patient. Do they have indwelling devices? Do they have an open wound, etc.?
Because remember, Karen said, if someone has an XDRO and they're on enhanced barrier precautions, it is for the duration
Yes.
of their stay in the building.
Yes.
So it doesn't really matter if they've been treated or not. Once that XDRO is identified, they get placed on enhanced barrier precautions and they stay on enhanced barrier precautions.
Right. And that's why I think it's so important. And I know I spent a lot of time trying to hammer into your heads the difference between the XDRO and MDRO, the terms in the toolkit, because I don't want you to get mixed up with them. If you see XDRO, that requires you to do at a minimum enhanced barrier precautions on those residents. And then again, but don't forget, if they have something that would require contact, you would need to do contact. But you're not going to get away from it at a minimum of enhanced barrier precautions for anybody with an XDRO.
And I was going to say one thing. Cheryl had a great idea. You know, you could do a follow-up webinar on this so that you have more time.
Oh, okay. I can't see the question, so
I know.
if there is something that I went over, Cheryl, if I went over something much too quickly, put that in chat too real quick so we can capture that, and then I can make sure that I spend a little bit more time on that next time.
Yeah. Great presentation, Karen, and great questions, guys.
That was
And I
excellent.
apologize for being rushed.
Thank you all for joining today. We are at 2 o'clock. Like Karen mentioned, if you do want anything else covered, you can either put it in the chat really quickly, or when you're taking the evaluation survey, which we have 2 ways to offer it now. It'll pop up for some people when Michael closes this webinar, or you can just scan this QR code to take the evaluation survey. There should be a spot for you to put suggestions. So if there's more you want to learn about EBP, please put it in there, and then we can use that to make our next presentation on this. Thank you, everyone. Have a great weekend.